he says it's not possible to maintain the military status quo because the UN are currently training the South Korean army. Hang on. Aren't they currently training the North Korean army? He doesn't mention that. All right. Okay. Yeah. See ya. January 27th, 1952. There are many obstacles to peace in this war, and we've seen how hard it is for the two sides to agree on things at the peace talks. And if you ask US President Harry Truman what the biggest obstacle is of them all, he will tell you, Moscow? I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week I talked a bit about the UN Medical Corps and some of the advancements that have made their work a bit easier and more successful in saving lives. Also, UN Commander Matt Ridgway did not, as he has often not, see eye to eye with Washington and with the Joint Chiefs about how best to continue the Panmunjom Peace Talks, what to concede on, and what to hold firm on. Communist delegate Lee Sang-cho has been denouncing the UN proposals at the talks as immoral and non-humanitarian. But when UN delegate Ruth Van Libbe asks for an example, he sort of dodges the question and asks questions of his own. Okay, here is an exchange between the two from the session on January 23rd with myself as Admiral Ruth Van Libbe and Tom Aldis as General Lee Sang-cho. I found it in Truce Tent and Fighting Front by Walter Hermes, or Hermes. Not certain how he pronounces it. You are extremely adept at refusing to give a direct answer to any question which our side asks. You are also extremely adept at capping your refusal to answer a question with 2 or 3 questions of your own, and then insisting that we must answer them. That is typical of the whole spirit with which your side approaches these negotiations. You've made blanket charges against our proposal, that it is immoral, that it is inhumanitarian, that it is unfair, and that it is unreasonable. When we attempt to pin you down to get you to show how, in the simplest case, in any one particular, our proposal is any one of these things, you wiggle out of it. You will not answer. You will not answer because you cannot answer.
One thing that we have found through the meeting is that when you try to delay the time of the meeting, you say that we did not give any answer, although we really have given one. And when we shrewdly pursue any question, you say that we make a smoke screen. This seems to be your only weapon, and a special stunt which you alone have. But we have a sound standpoint. We love truth and righteousness, and standing upon the truth, we do our work. And from righteousness and truth, we speak and insist.
However, whether the communists were standing on the truth or trampling it was unimportant, for the key fact was they would not recognize the principle of voluntary repatriation. They insist that it does not go along with the Geneva Convention. The US State Department tries to counter this by sending Libby their interpretation of the convention. And under Article 6, as they point out, the different sides to a conflict are allowed to make special arrangements with regard to POWs as long as those POWs are not deprived of their rights according to the rest of the convention. The whole idea behind the convention, after all, is to protect individuals and their rights. So the State Department does not see how voluntary repatriation is in any way inconsistent with such protection. But it isn't just voluntary repatriation the communists oppose. It is the parole feature in general of the UN proposal, being released under the promise of not taking up arms again once released. And that is also an issue. Since all the prisoners who would be paroled belong to the communists, the enemy delegates claimed that was a unilateral requirement upon their side. UN Delegate Chief Admiral Joy was inclined to agree with them and suggested there were 2 possible solutions. Either he could be given authority to extend the parole feature to both sides to guarantee that repatriated POWs would not be permitted or compelled to bear arms against the other side, or he should be allowed to drop the parole feature entirely from the UNC position. The South Korean government opposes paroling prisoners anyway, and hey, does anybody think that the communist side would not put their recovered personnel back into the military anyhow, even if they say they won't? Ridgway tells Joy he can use his own discretion as to whether or not to drop the parole requirement. Joy is loath to concede to even the smallest of issues, though. He feels the other side sees concession as weakness. In fact, there is an interview with Turner Joy in US News and World Report that comes out now on the 25th, in which he says, "You can influence the communist side only with patience and firmness backed by application of military force. He is currently trying to negotiate a stable armistice during a military stalemate, and unless the other side has a voluntary change of heart, the UN would have to use enough military force to make him change his mind." As for the issue of allowing airfields to be built or rebuilt after an armistice, the UN is changing tactics in mid and late January. Now they're no longer attacking the concept of new airfields, but the communist motivation for insisting upon the freedom to build more airfields. General Xi is arguing for the communists. He insisted that an agreement not to introduce any reinforcing aircraft into Korea covered the UNC objections, yet refused to state categorically that the communists would not increase their military power during an armistice. This placed the matter in the realm of good faith. And since the UN command was unwilling to lean on so slim a reed, little progress was made. If you think Xi remains on the defensive, though, you are mistaken. He vigorously attacks the idea that the balance of military capabilities must be maintained after an armistice. I've gone over this before. He says they should eliminate the state of war, which means all foreign troops should be withdrawn from Korea. This sounds reasonable. And Xi adds that anyway, it would be impossible to maintain the status quo, since the UN is currently busy training the ROK, the South Koreans, and expanding that army. He neglects to mention that the communists are doing the same thing with the KPA, the North Korean army. But he still kind of has a point. Well, it is this week that the UN command decides that working out the details of all of this, item 3 on the agenda, should be turned over to staff officers. This would mean the airfield issue could be postponed, which is what Washington wants, and they can focus on some of the other smaller disagreements. Xi agrees today, the 27th, that the sub-delegations should recess until the staff officers can do their thing. If they can solve all the issues beside the airfields one, UN command thinks that they'll be in a good position to offer a final deal. The airfields in general are certainly getting a lot of use just now. I talked about Operation Strangle a couple weeks ago, the many months long UN campaign to destroy enemy logistical capability from the air, and that despite all the sorties and all the damage, the other side is still capable of moving men and supplies up to the front and even slowly stockpiling them. This month, the carriers Essex, Antietam, and Valley Forge have joined in, and they are focused on cutting railway tracks. Each carrier has several 20-kilometer track sections assigned to it, right? And naval planes have been busy bombing stretches of rail so thoroughly that in many cases they have achieved total destruction of the roadbed. Then they cleverly immediately follow this up with constant surveillance so that they can't be rebuilt, which totally takes the enemy by surprise. And some breaks now remain unrepaired for 10 days or more. The railway line from Kowon to the port of Wonsan has now been out of operation for about 2 weeks. I wonder how the communists might try to adapt to meet this new tactic. Speaking of ships, the UN also has a total blockade of North Korea by sea, of course. If the infantry ashore had to endure harsh conditions in winter, their lot was matched by the deck crews of the United Nations ships. In winter, the endless coast patrols went on despite pack ice and the continual need to remove ice from the ship's superstructures, a task which had to be done manually, often in blizzards and a full gale. Many former crew members would long remember the depressing sight of thick ice formed on the interior bulkhead walls of their mess decks. The ships patrolling of the coasts have plenty of other issues to deal with as well. For example, HMAS Warramunga was up near Chongjin on the northeast coast of North Korea near the Soviet border. And in order to bomb the railway bridge there, Captain Ramsey went up a narrow tidal channel to get to closer range, leading to his ship being in water so narrow that he stopped the engines to allow the tide to turn the ship along its length. He got the joy of doing this under enemy fire too, and his exit back to sea was even more dramatic as his forward guns returned fire and took out the enemy field guns. This week, on the 23rd, a naval operation is completed. 4 LSTs attached to Taffy 90 have been evacuating refugees from islands off the west coast who have been under threat from the communists. This began in December, and more than 20,000 people have been removed to South Korean locations. The operation is suspended now because of an outbreak of typhoid. I talked last week about both helicopter evacuation of wounded troops and that there are helicopters stationed on the Western Islands. This week, Operation Helicopter is in action from the 21st to the 24th. This is wounded personnel being evacuated by helicopter, but flown directly to the hospital ship USS Consolation, the only hospital ship with a landing pad for helicopters. And so the war continues. There are a lot of obstacles to peace, right? And everyone has his own opinion about them. But what about President Harry Truman? Well, to him, the greatest obstacle to peace is not in Panmunjom, where the talks are being held, but in Moscow. Today, January 27th, he writes in his diary that maybe they should give the USSR an ultimatum with a 10-day expiration limit. What sort of ultimatum? Well, he muses I say, that unless the Soviets pushed the Chinese towards a settlement that ended the war, the U.S. might bomb Manchurian military bases, blockade China by sea, and, if necessary, enter into all-out war with the Soviets. Say what? Yep, that's what he is jotting down today as the week ends. Truman has made many public pledges not to use atomic weapons in Korea, but behind the scenes, already in December 1950, non-assembled atomic bombs were transported to an American carrier off the Korean coast. And several times, American planes have made simulated atomic bombing raids over Pyongyang. Just contingency planning, but still. And so the week ends, with sailors freezing off the coast of Korea, naval aircraft in the skies over Korea, more back and forth about airfields and POWs at the talks, and Truman's musings. I'll end today by reading exactly what Harry Truman writes in his diary today, January 27th, 1952. I found it in the introduction of Joseph Goldin's Korea, the Untold Story of the War. Dealing with communist governments is like an honest man trying to deal with a numbers racket king or the head of a dope ring. It seems to me the proper approach now would be an ultimatum with a 10-day time limit, informing Moscow that we intend to blockade the China coast from the Korean border to Indochina, and that we intend to destroy every military base in Manchuria, including submarine bases, by means now in our control. And if there is further interference, we shall eliminate any ports or cities necessary to accomplish our peaceful purposes. This means all-out war. It means Moscow, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, Mukden, Vladivostok, Peking, Shanghai, Port Arthur, Dairen, Odessa, Stalingrad, and every manufacturing plant in China and the Soviet Union will be eliminated. This is the final chance for the Soviet government to decide whether it desires to survive or not. Those are very heavy words. I certainly hope we manage to avoid them being acted upon and World War III beginning. But whether or not that happens, I shall be here to cover it thanks to the sterling efforts of the Time Ghost Army, for that is who makes this possible. You too can join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Bobby Redig, or Redig, is the Army Member of the Week for this channel. These are the newest commissioned officers. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.